No one in this room gets paid to be wrong, Daniel Whitmore said without looking up, his voice calm, but heavy enough to silence 12 of the sharpest minds money could buy, and the number on the screen behind him, $480,000,000, hung in the air like a quiet accusation, the kind that didn't need to be spoken twice, because everyone already felt it pressing against their ribs as if the room itself had grown smaller under the weight of that loss. And still no one had an answer, not the Harvard analyst tapping nervously on his tablet, not the MIT strategist pacing in tight circles, not even Daniel himself, who stood at the head of the glass conference table with the stillness of someone used to control, used to certainty, used to being the one who solved problems rather than waited for them to be solved. And yet here he was, watching hours slip by like sand through clenched fingers, while in the far corner of the room, unnoticed by everyone except the quiet hum of the air conditioning, Clara Hayes refilled a water glass with steady hands, her movements precise, almost invisible, the way people become when they learn early that being overlooked is safer than being seen, and she might have remained just that, another shadow moving between suits and screens. If her eyes hadn't lingered half a second too long on the projection, just long enough to notice something no one else had. A small inconsistency buried beneath layers of data, a detail so simple it almost hid itself in plain sight, and she paused, just for a moment, the picture hovering midair, her gaze sharpening in a way that didn't belong to someone wearing a black apron and comfortable shoes, because this wasn't just numbers to her, it was a pattern, and patterns had a way of revealing truth when people stopped trying so hard to control them. But no one saw that pause. No one noticed the slight shift in her breathing, because all attention snapped back to Daniel as one of the analysts cleared his throat and offered yet another explanation, something about market volatility and risk distribution, words that sounded impressive until they dissolved under scrutiny, and Daniel didn't even respond at first. He just stared at the screen, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, before finally exhaling through his nose in a way that carried more disappointment than anger. And then, almost absently, as if speaking to no one in particular, he said, "We've been at this for 3 hours," and the room stilled again, because they all knew what that meant. It meant failure was no longer theoretical, it was real, measurable, sitting right there in bright white digits, and still no one had the courage to say they were out of answers, while Clara, now standing quietly beside the table, set the water down with a soft clink that barely registered, except that it did. Somehow, to Daniel, whose eyes flicked toward her for the briefest second, not with interest, but with the kind of automatic glance reserved for movement, for background noise, for things that didn't matter, and yet there was something about the way she stood, still, composed, watching without intruding, that lingered just a fraction longer than it should have, before he turned back to the screen and said, almost under his breath, "So this is it." And no one answered, because no one could, and in that silence, Clara's gaze returned to the numbers, to that one small inconsistency, and for the first time since she walked into the room, her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, not out of nerves, but recognition, because sometimes the biggest problems weren't unsolvable, they were just being solved the wrong way, and the difference between those two things was everything. The silence stretched just a little too long, the kind that made people shift in their seats and glance at each other for reassurance that someone else would speak first, but no one did, and Daniel Whitmore finally turned away from the screen, his gaze sweeping across the room with quiet precision, measuring not intelligence but hesitation, and that was what disappointed him most, not that they had failed, but that they had stopped pushing, and as his eyes moved, they landed again on Clara, still standing there with the empty pitcher, still watching, and this time he did not look away immediately, because there was something about her expression that did not match the room. It was not frustration, not confusion, not even concern. It was focus, the kind that belonged to someone who was not overwhelmed by the problem, and that alone made him pause, just for a fraction of a second, before he said, almost casually, "You keep looking at that screen," and the words were not loud, but they cut through the air more effectively than any raised voice, and a few heads turned, following his line of sight, until the room collectively noticed her for the first time, really noticed her, and Clara did not flinch. She did not look away. She simply met his gaze with a calm that felt out of place in a room full of tension. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, until one of the analysts let out a short, dismissive laugh and said, "She is probably just wondering what any of it means." And a few others smiled, not out of cruelty, but out of habit, because it was easier to assume than to question, and Daniel tilted his head slightly, considering, not the comment, but her reaction to it, which was nothing, no irritation, no embarrassment, just stillness, and that, more than anything, caught his attention, because people who had nothing to offer usually tried to hide, and she was not hiding, she was waiting, and that difference was subtle, but it was there, and he turned his body toward her fully now, resting one hand lightly on the edge of the table as he said, "Do you understand what you are looking at?" And the question was not kind, but it was not unkind either. It was neutral, almost clinical, the way he asked questions in boardrooms and negotiations, and Clara glanced at the screen once more before answering, her voice quiet but steady. "I understand enough." And the room reacted immediately, not with outrage, but with amusement, a ripple of low laughter that moved from one end of the table to the other, because confidence from the wrong person always sounded like a joke, and Daniel did not smile. He watched her instead, measuring the space between what she said and how she said it. And then, after a brief pause that felt longer than it was, he gestured slightly toward the screen and said, "Then tell me what we are missing." And this time the laughter was sharper, more open, because now it was a test, and everyone knew it. And someone muttered under their breath, "This should be interesting," while another leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, already expecting entertainment rather than insight. But Clara did not move right away. She did not rush to speak, and that hesitation might have looked like uncertainty to anyone else. But it was not. It was calculation, the kind that happened quietly, internally, before a single word was chosen. And then she stepped forward, just one step, placing the empty pitcher down on the table with a soft, deliberate sound. And in that moment, the room shifted in a way no one could quite explain, because suddenly she was no longer just part of the background. She was part of the problem, and Daniel watched her closely now, not with skepticism, but with something closer to curiosity, because whether she failed or not no longer mattered as much as what she would reveal in the attempt. And Clara lifted her eyes to the screen again, her voice calm, almost conversational, as she said, "You are all trying to fix the outcome." And she paused, just long enough for the words to settle, before adding, "But no one is asking why it is happening in the first place." And the laughter stopped, not because they agreed, but because they were no longer sure they should disagree. And Daniel did not speak. He just stared at her, his expression unchanged, but something behind it had shifted, something small, but real, because for the first time that night, someone had not offered an answer, they had challenged the question. No one moved, not immediately, because what Clara had said did not sound like an answer. It sounded like a disruption, the kind that forced people to reconsider something they had already convinced themselves was correct, and that was always uncomfortable, especially for those who were used to being right. And one of the analysts leaned forward, his voice sharper now, less amused, more defensive, as he said, "We have already analyzed the root cause. That is exactly what we have been doing for the past 3 hours." And Clara turned her head slightly toward him, not challenging, not dismissing, just acknowledging, before her eyes returned to the screen, and she shook her head once, gently, as if correcting something small but important. "You analyzed what changed," she said, her tone even, but not what stayed the same. And that landed differently, quieter, but heavier, because it did not argue with their effort. It questioned their direction, and Daniel's fingers, resting against the edge of the table, stilled completely, his attention narrowing in a way that those who worked with him recognized instantly. This was the moment he stopped evaluating people and started listening. And Clara stepped closer to the screen now, not hurried, not hesitant, just certain, and she reached for a marker left on the table, holding it lightly between her fingers as if it were something familiar rather than something borrowed. And without asking permission, she circled a small section of the projected data, a line most of them had already looked at and dismissed as stable, insignificant. "This part," she said, tapping it once, "has not changed in 6 quarters." And a few of the analysts exchanged glances, because that was true, and because it was exactly why they had ignored it. and Clara continued, her voice calm, almost quiet enough to miss if the room had not been completely silent. So you assumed it was not the problem. And no one interrupted her, not because they agreed, but because they were now waiting, and waiting was not something they were used to doing for someone like her. And she drew a small line connecting that stable data point to another section on the screen, one that showed the loss growing over time, and she did not rush her explanation. She let the connection sit there for a second, visible, undeniable, before she said, "But if the outcome is changing, and this part is not, then either your assumption about it is wrong, or your model is." And that was when the shift happened, subtle, but unmistakable, because now the room was no longer listening out of curiosity, it was listening out of necessity, and the same analyst who had spoken before frowned, leaning forward as if seeing the data. For the first time, "That does not make sense," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, and Clara nodded slightly, as if she had expected that reaction. "It does not," she agreed, "unless the baseline itself is flawed." And Daniel's eyes flicked to the circled section again, then back to her, and there was something new in his expression now, not approval, not yet, but recognition. The kind that comes when a thought you did not realize you had begins to take shape in someone else's words. And Clara placed the marker down on the table with a soft click, her hands returning to stillness. And for a moment she said nothing more, allowing the implication to settle over them, because she did not need to prove anything further. The gap in their logic was already visible, and all they had to do was see it. And Daniel finally straightened, his voice quieter than before, but far more focused, as he said, "Explain it. Not as a challenge, not as a command, but as a request." And that was the moment everything changed, because he was no longer testing her. He was asking her to continue. Clara did not answer immediately, and that pause, brief as it was, carried more weight than any rushed explanation could have, because she was not trying to impress them. She was making sure they could follow, and when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, almost quiet, as if the solution itself did not require volume, only clarity. "You are treating that baseline like it is fixed," she said, her eyes moving between the screen and Daniel. "But it is not fixed, it is assumed." And she reached for the marker again, drawing a second line beneath the first, this time under a column labeled Projected Stability, a section that had gone unquestioned for months, maybe longer. "Everything you built on top of this," she continued, tapping the lower line gently, "depends on this being accurate." And one of the analysts shifted in his chair, his confidence thinning as he said, "It is accurate. We validated it." But Clara shook her head slightly, not dismissing him, just correcting the idea. "You validated the output," she said, "not the source." And that distinction landed harder than anything before it, because it was simple, almost obvious, and yet no one had said it. And Daniel's gaze sharpened again, his mind already moving ahead, testing her words against what he knew, what he had approved, what he had trusted. And Clara continued, her tone steady. "If the source is even slightly off, every projection after it will amplify the error." And she drew a small upward curve connecting the baseline to the loss figure. "That is why the loss keeps growing," she said. "Not because the market is unpredictable, but because your model is consistently wrong in the same place." And the room fell into a deeper silence, not empty, but active, filled with recalculations, with shifting assumptions, with the quiet realization that something fundamental had been overlooked. And the same analyst who had challenged her earlier leaned forward again, this time without sarcasm, his voice lower, more careful. "So what are you saying? That the baseline data is incorrect?" And Clara met his question without hesitation. "I am saying it was correct when it was created," she replied, "but it has not been updated to reflect what actually changed." And she gestured lightly toward the screen. "You assume stability where there is drift." And Daniel exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, because he saw it now, not as a theory, but as a pattern, the kind he had built his career recognizing, the kind that separated noise from signal. And for a moment he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the data as if it might rearrange itself under closer inspection. And then he asked, quietly, "What do we do?" And it was not directed at his team, not this time. And Clara set the marker down once more, her hands returning to stillness as she answered. "You rebuild the model from the source," she said. But you do not start with the numbers. And she paused, just long enough for them to expect something more complex, something technical, something worthy of the room they were in. Before she finished, you start with the assumption you made when you stopped questioning it. And that was when the weight of the problem shifted completely, because the answer was no longer buried in the data, it was in the thinking that shaped it. And Daniel straightened slightly, his expression unreadable but no longer dismissive. And for the first time that night, the room was not searching for answers. It was rethinking everything it thought it already knew. No one argued this time, not because they fully understood yet, but because something deeper had shifted, something harder to defend than numbers or models, because assumptions were personal, and challenging them felt different. And Daniel Whitmore slowly walked toward the screen, his steps measured, controlled, but there was a subtle change in his posture, a slight forward lean that only appeared when he was genuinely engaged. And he studied the lines Clara had drawn, not as markings, but as fractures, small cracks in a structure he had trusted. And behind him, one of the analysts spoke again, his voice quieter now, stripped of earlier confidence. If the baseline drifted, we would have seen it in the quarterly reports. And Clara turned slightly, her expression unchanged. You did see it, she said, and the simplicity of that answer made him pause. You just explained it away. And the room fell still again, because that was harder to deny, not a technical flaw, but a human one. And Daniel's gaze did not leave the screen as he asked, "Where?" And Clara stepped closer, not to take control, but to guide attention, her finger hovering just above a subtle variance in the data, a fraction of a percentage point, repeated over 6 quarters, each instance small enough to ignore on its own, but together forming a pattern that now seemed impossible to miss. Here, she said softly, and here, each point marked not with urgency, but with certainty. It never spiked, so it never triggered concern, and she let her hand fall back to her side. But it never corrected either, and one of the analysts leaned forward quickly, pulling up additional data on his tablet, his fingers moving faster now, not to prove her wrong, but to verify what he was starting to see. And his expression changed almost immediately, the shift subtle but unmistakable, as he whispered, more to himself than to the room, "It compounds." And Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second, not out of frustration, but recognition, because that was it, not a sudden failure, not an external shock, but a slow accumulation of overlooked error. And when he opened them again, he turned to Clara, really turned this time, his attention no longer divided, no longer casual. "If we adjust for that drift," he said, his voice low but steady, "what happens?" And Clara did not rush to answer. She did not reach for the marker again. She simply looked at the screen, then back at him. "You stop losing," she said, and the room held its breath, waiting for more, for a condition, a complication, a limitation. But she added nothing for a moment, letting the weight of that statement settle, before continuing. "And then you start seeing where the opportunity actually is." And that was when the final shift occurred, because this was no longer about fixing a loss. It was about uncovering something they had missed entirely, and Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in focus, as he turned back to the screen, already recalculating, already restructuring the problem in his mind. And behind him, the analysts began moving again, not in scattered discussion, but in aligned direction, pulling up source data, cross-checking assumptions, rebuilding the model from the foundation Clara had just exposed. And in the middle of it all, she stepped back, quietly, almost seamlessly, returning to the edge of the room as if nothing had changed, as if she had not just redirected the thinking of an entire team. And Daniel noticed that too. The way she withdrew without expectation, without recognition, and for the first time that night, he did not look at her like someone out of place. He looked at her like someone he had completely misjudged. And he said nothing, because there was nothing to say yet, only something to understand. The room no longer sounded the same. The quiet tension from before had been replaced by a different kind of energy, sharper, more focused, as fingers moved across screens and data sets refreshed in real time. But beneath all of it, there was something else, something unspoken, a recognition that the direction had not come from where anyone expected. And Daniel Whitmore stood still at the center of it, watching the model rebuild itself piece by piece, his eyes tracking every adjustment, every recalculation, not as a spectator, but as someone measuring the accuracy of a new perspective against years of instinct. And one of the analysts finally spoke, his voice carrying a note of disbelief he could not quite hide. If we correct the baseline drift and re-weight the projections, the loss curve flattens, and another voice followed almost immediately. Not just flattens, it reverses in the next 2 quarters. And the words hung there, not celebrated, not questioned, just absorbed, because they all understood what that meant. And Daniel's gaze shifted slowly from the screen to Clara, who was now standing near the edge of the room again, her presence quiet, almost invisible once more, as if she had already stepped out of the moment she created. And for a second, he simply watched her, not with curiosity anymore, but with something more deliberate, something closer to respect, though he had not said it yet. And then he turned back to the team, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying a clarity that had been missing earlier. "Rebuild everything from the source," he said. No assumptions carry over. And no one argued, no one hesitated, because the authority in his voice was no longer just positional. It was aligned with something they now saw too. And as the room moved with renewed purpose, Daniel took a step away from the table, his attention no longer fixed on the data, but on the person who had changed how they saw it. And he walked toward her, not quickly, not dramatically, just with intention, stopping a few feet away as she adjusted the tray in her hands, preparing to leave as if her role in the room had ended the moment the water glasses were filled. And for a brief moment neither of them spoke, because the dynamic between them had shifted in a way words had not yet caught up to. And Daniel finally said, quietly, "Clara," using her name for the first time, not as a formality, but as recognition. And she looked up at him, her expression unchanged, calm, attentive, waiting. And he studied her for a second longer, as if confirming something he had already decided, before asking, "Where did you learn to see things like that?" And it was not a test, not a challenge, just a question, direct and unguarded. And Clara held his gaze for a moment, then glanced briefly toward the screen where the team continued working, before answering in the same quiet tone she had used all along. "I learned to notice what people stop questioning." And the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than a detailed explanation ever could, because it was not about credentials or titles, it was about attention. And Daniel exhaled slowly, a faint shift in his posture signaling something internal, something recalibrating. And behind him, one of the analysts called out, "We are seeing a 12% recovery if we adjust the model fully." And another added, "Potential upside if we reallocate based on the corrected data." And Daniel did not turn around immediately. He let those words settle, then nodded once, almost to himself, before looking back at Clara. And for the first time since the meeting began, there was no distance in his expression, no hierarchy, just a clear, unspoken acknowledgement that what she had done mattered. And he said nothing more in that moment, because anything he could say would have been smaller than the shift that had already taken place. And Clara, as if sensing that, gave a slight nod in return, not as acceptance, not as pride, just as understanding, before she turned and quietly stepped away, leaving behind a room that would not see things the same way again. Clara moved through the hallway outside the conference room with the same quiet rhythm she had carried all evening, the tray balanced steadily in her hands, her steps unhurried, as if nothing inside that glass room had altered the course of her shift. And behind her the door remained slightly open, just enough for fragments of conversation to spill into the corridor, numbers being recalculated, voices sharper now, more alive. And yet she did not turn back, because she had already said what needed to be said, and for her, that was enough. But inside the room Daniel Whitmore stood still for a moment longer than anyone expected, his attention lingering not on the projections, not on the voices calling out improved margins and revised forecasts, but on the space she had just left. And something about that absence felt louder than the conversation behind him. And one of the analysts approached cautiously, holding up a tablet with updated figures. "We are projecting a recovery within 18 months if we follow the new model," he said, his tone careful, as if testing the ground beneath his own certainty. And Daniel glanced at the screen briefly, nodding once. But his focus was not fully there, because the numbers, for the first time that night, were no longer the most interesting part of the room. And he stepped away from the table again, his movement subtle but deliberate, and crossed toward the door, ignoring the surprised glances that followed him. Because CEOs did not usually leave in the middle of resolution, not when everything was finally aligning, but Daniel did, because something more important had shifted, something that did not exist on a spreadsheet. And when he reached the hallway, he saw her at the far end, placing a stack of glasses onto a service cart, her posture the same, composed, focused on the task in front of her. And for a second, he simply watched, noticing details he had not allowed himself to see before, the precision in her movements, the way she paused briefly before setting each glass down as if aligning them mattered, as if order was not just a habit but a principle. And he walked toward her, his steps quieter now, less commanding, until he stopped a few feet away, and she looked up, not startled, not uncertain, just present, and the contrast between them felt different here, outside the room, stripped of titles and projections, just two people standing in a quiet corridor, and Daniel spoke, his voice lower than before. They are rebuilding the entire model, and Clara nodded slightly, as if that outcome had always been expected. They will find more than they were looking for, she replied, and he studied her for a moment, the weight of that statement settling in, because it was not just about profit or recovery, it was about perspective, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing just enough to reveal something rarely seen, not weakness, but reflection. You changed the way they think, he said, not as praise, but as fact, and Clara tilted her head slightly, considering his words before responding. I just asked a different question, and that answer stayed with him, not because it was modest, but because it was accurate. And Daniel looked down the hallway briefly, then back at her, and there was a pause. Not awkward, not forced, just quiet. And in that silence, something shifted again, something smaller but deeper, because for the first time, he was not trying to evaluate her. He was trying to understand her, and that was a position he was not used to being in. And behind him, the faint sound of voices calling his name echoed from the conference room, pulling at his attention, reminding him of where he belonged. And yet he did not move immediately, because for a moment, just a moment, he chose to stay where he was, in the space where certainty had been replaced by curiosity. And when he finally spoke again, his tone carried none of the authority it had at the beginning of the night, only clarity. Not many people do that, he said, and Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that did not seek recognition, only acknowledgement, before she picked up the cart and began to move past him, her voice soft as she said, "That is why they miss what matters." And then she continued down the hallway, leaving Daniel standing there, not with answers, but with a different kind of awareness, one that did not demand control, only attention. And for the first time in a long time, he did not rush back to the room, because he understood something now that could not be calculated, that sometimes the most important shift does not happen in the numbers, but in the way you choose to see them. Daniel stood in the hallway a moment longer after Clara disappeared around the corner, the faint sound of the service cart wheels fading into the distance, and for the first time that night, the urgency that usually drove him forward did not immediately return, because something quieter had taken its place, something that did not push, but pulled. And when he finally turned back toward the conference room, his steps were slower, more deliberate, as if he was not just walking back to a problem, but to a different way of approaching it. And when he re-entered, the energy inside had transformed completely, screens filled with recalibrated models, voices no longer overlapping in confusion but aligning in purpose. And one of the analysts looked up as Daniel approached, his expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "We ran the corrected baseline through 3 scenarios," he said. "Every single one eliminates the projected loss." And another added quickly, "And not just eliminates it, it reveals an entirely new growth channel we were not tracking before." And Daniel listened. But this time he did not interrupt, did not direct, he simply observed, allowing the team to follow the path that had already been set in motion. And as the numbers stabilized into something coherent, something actionable, a quiet realization settled across the room, not spoken, but shared, that none of this had come from them, not originally, and that awareness shifted the weight of the moment, because success felt different when it was built on a correction rather than an assumption. And Daniel finally stepped forward, his gaze moving across the data one last time before he spoke, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying something new beneath it. Implement the revised model. Immediately, he said. No delays, no partial adjustments. And the team nodded, already moving to execute, because the clarity in his tone left no room for hesitation. And yet, even as they worked, there was a subtle restraint in the room, as if everyone understood that the real shift had already happened before the numbers confirmed it. And Daniel turned slightly, his eyes drifting once more toward the door, toward the hallway where Clara had been, and for a brief second, he saw the entire night differently, not as a problem solved, but as a perspective corrected, and he exhaled slowly, almost quietly, before one of the senior analysts spoke again, this time more carefully. Sir, should we document the original oversight for internal review? And Daniel looked at him, then at the screen, then back again, and after a short pause, he said, yes, but his voice carried a different weight now, not just procedural, but intentional. Document the assumption that caused it. And the analyst hesitated slightly, as if expecting more, and Daniel added, that is what we missed. And that instruction changed the tone of the task entirely, because it was no longer about correcting numbers, it was about understanding thinking. And as the team began outlining the report, tracing the error back to its origin, Daniel stepped away from the table again, not out of distraction, but because his role in the room had shifted as well, and for the first time, he was not leading from certainty, but from awareness, and he glanced once more toward the hallway, not expecting to see her, but acknowledging the absence that had reshaped everything. And then he returned his attention to the room, but not as the same person who had walked in hours earlier, because the difference was subtle, almost invisible to anyone else, but undeniable to him. And it was this: he no longer assumed he was seeing everything that mattered, and that realization, quiet as it was, would outlast any projection on the screen. The meeting ended without applause, without celebration, just a quiet agreement that something had been corrected, and as the analysts filed out one by one, their conversation softer now, more reflective than before, the room slowly returned to its original stillness, screens dimming, chairs settling back into place, and Daniel Whitmore remained where he was, standing near the table, his gaze resting not on the final projections, but on the faint marker lines still visible on the glass board. Simple strokes that had redirected everything, and he reached out, almost absently, and wiped part of it away with his hand, watching as the line disappeared, but the meaning behind it did not, and for a moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing left to solve, only something left to understand. And when he finally turned and walked out of the room, the hallway felt different, quieter, not because it had changed, but because he had, and he moved past the same walls, the same polished floors, but his attention lingered longer now, on small details he would have ignored before, the alignment of frames, the rhythm of footsteps in the distance, the subtle order in places that did not demand to be seen. And when he reached the service area, he saw Clara again, standing by the counter, carefully stacking clean glasses into neat rows, her movements precise, consistent, as if she approached every task with the same level of thought, whether anyone noticed or not. And he stopped a few feet away, not interrupting immediately, just observing, because now he understood that what mattered was not what she did when asked, but how she saw things when no one was asking. And after a moment, he spoke, his voice steady, but quieter than it had been at the beginning of the night. The model is fixed, he said, not as an announcement, but as a continuation, and Clara glanced up briefly, her expression calm, acknowledging the outcome without surprise. Good, she replied, returning her attention to the glasses as she aligned the last one perfectly with the rest, and Daniel watched that small action, the care in it, the intention, and it reinforced something he had only just begun to realize, that the way someone does one thing often reflects the way they approach everything. And he took a small step closer, not imposing, just present. We would not have seen it, he said, in this time there was no distance in his tone, no hierarchy, just honesty. And Clara paused for a second, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, before she said, "You would have." And he frowned slightly, not disagreeing, but questioning, and she met his gaze, her voice still quiet, but clear, "Just not tonight." And that answer settled differently, not as contradiction, but as perspective, because it acknowledged his capability without dismissing the moment, and Daniel exhaled slowly. A faint shift in his expression revealing something rare, acceptance, not just of her insight, but of his own limitation in that moment. And he nodded once, a small gesture, but deliberate. "Thank you," he said. And the words were simple, but they carried weight, because they were not transactional. They were earned, and Clara gave a slight nod in return, not seeking more, not expecting more, just receiving what was given. And then she picked up the tray again, preparing to continue her shift, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and Daniel stepped back, allowing her to pass, watching as she moved down the hallway once more, her presence blending into the background again, but no longer invisible to him. And as she disappeared from view, he remained there for a moment, not thinking about the numbers, not about the recovery, but about the question she had introduced, the one that had changed everything. And he realized that the real cost that night had not been the $48 million on the screen, but the assumption that no one had challenged. And as he turned to leave, that understanding stayed with him, quiet, steady, and far more valuable than any solution they had built, because he did not just walk away with a corrected model. He walked away with a different standard, one he had not raised his voice to demand, but one that had been shown to him in silence.